The president refuses to attend yet another day of questioning at the anti-corruption office on this Friday, choosing instead to remain in his detention cell as investigators look to seek a warrant to extend his arrest. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Friday, January 17th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we continue our talk on President Yoon Suk Yeol's arrest and its broader implications. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post returning for a second time this week to share her own coverage of the political situation here. Kelly, thank you so much for making time.
Thanks for having me.
I also have our own foreign pundit, writer Colin Marshall, with his take on the political situation here in South Korea. Colin, as always, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine, Sunhee.
Right, Kelly, let's start with the updates regarding the president's arrest as well as, of course, his impeachment trial.
Yeah, so President Yoon became the first sitting president in South Korean history to be detained Wednesday. It's Friday here now, so it's been about 2-ish days that he's been detained. My understanding is that he was questioned for about 10 hours that first day on Wednesday, and that he basically has not really been questioned since, that he's refused to appear for questioning, citing his health, saying that, it's his right not to answer questions, which it is, and that he has nothing more to say. And at this point, all of us are basically waiting to see whether or not that arrest warrant will be issued. The deadline is today, and there are all indications in local media that they're working on issuing it very quickly. So we might see a formal arrest in the next couple of hours.
Right. Colin, based on your reading of the foreign media coverage of the president's arrest and his trial, of course, what appears to be the overall assessment of the political situation here in the country?
Well, the Western media in particular has a certain fairly strong framing that Yoon went rogue against democracy itself, and the media tend to task South Korea with protecting that democracy from an individual like Yoon or anyone else who would take up this seeming mission of sort of returning to a dictatorship, 1980s style. It's a fairly high-minded framing, to my mind. I tend to see more of a power struggle going on, but I can understand that interpretation. One element of the story that doesn't quite get so much emphasis in the Western media is the nature of Yoon's behavior. I mean, the behavior itself gets a lot of attention because some of it seems outlandish to Western readers and viewers. But Yoon is also, I wouldn't call him the most law-abiding president in Korean history necessarily, but he does, as Kelly's answer suggested, he does show a grasp, he demonstrates a grasp of what the law allows him to do. And in a way, he's a more law-conscious Korean president than the past ones, than his predecessors, in that many Korean presidents, perhaps all presidents before him, have been driven or powered in a sense by their approval rating. And when their approval drops, the wind goes out of their sails. That has not been the case for Yoon, not at all. And he started off with not much of a mandate. He wasn't voted in by a high margin, and his approval rating was never excellent, never strong. But he has behaved in such a way that he knows what he can do. He knows where the very edges of his abilities granted by law are. He exceeds them, yes, but this is a sort of, it's 법대로 해, go by the law. And that is a mindset that is somewhat foreign, at least from what I can tell, for Koreans when they view their president. Oh, this is a president who is operating in a sort of legalistic framework. Not surprising, given what he was before he was the president.
Right, of course. Keeping that in mind, Kelly, you actually wrote a piece for the Washington Post about leaders here in Korea whose political careers were tainted by scandals. How does President Yoon Suk Yeol's story, keeping in mind, of course, what Colin has just said, look to go down in history, do you think?
Yeah, I think unfortunately for him, his career is always going to be painted in scandal at this point. I don't think that he's going to experience kind of a favorable reversal retrospectively that maybe No Moo-hyun faced posthumously. President Yoon is one of, I believe, 3 now to have been impeached, the most recent being Park Geun-hye back in 2016 and 2017. He's the first sitting president to be detained, and his fate remains uncertain. And I think at this point, that will probably overshadow much of his legacy. I mean, to be quite frank, I'm not sure how much he was able to get done that would suggest a different narrative in the history books before all of this happened. In general, his story has kind of been this sort of political outsider who won by a sliver of the vote, was able to tap into a feeling of discontent among young male swing voters at a time when Korea really wanted something that was not the establishment anymore. This country continues to struggle with chronic issues like youth unemployment, a lack of entrepreneurship and job availability, this feeling of being stagnant after decades of astronomical growth. And so I think a lot of people put faith in the idea that he was going to be, a big feather ruffler, so to speak, and that he would enact some really big change, go against the establishment. And some of that has turned out to be true, but maybe not in favor of resolving those issues. So unfortunately, I think in the history books, it's not looking so favorable for him.
Right. And against this backdrop, Colin, The Economist claims that the presidency of South Korea can be a treacherous job. Do you suppose this is a fair assessment?
That's one way of putting it, certainly. It's a job that I wonder why anybody wants it. I mean, I'm from the United States, and I've always thought, I can't get in the mind of anybody. I can't imagine the thinking of somebody who wants to be president of the United States. But the president of South Korea is a position maybe even worse, definitely worse, I would say, than being the president of the US. Because we've seen in the history of South Korean presidents, their fates do not tend to be desirable ones. It could be jail, you could be just hated, there could be people trying to put you in jail, or it could be even worse than that. I mean, there's no afterlife of the presidency which I would want for myself, I'll put it that way. Although Moon Jae-in runs a bookstore, and I've visited that bookstore, it seems pleasant enough. But there's still protesters saying lock him up on the road to the bookstore. So it's an isolating job as well. It's the case that most South Korean presidents, the complaint about them is that they listen only to a tiny inner circle. And that circle has contracted a lot. I mean, Yoon is accused of listening to no one at all, maybe his wife. But you can sense that South Korean presidents become very out of touch in many cases. And that's part of the problem as well. But there's this phenomenon or this accusation that gets made, and it's been getting made more with this whole martial law fiasco of South Korea having an imperial presidency or a royal presidency. The presidency has too much power. That's the thrust of the accusation. Although I think what we've seen, I mean, based on the fate of Yoon Suk Yeol so far, and even with Park Geun-hye, the presidency is probably not all that imperial. These two have not been invulnerable. I think that's been vividly illustrated by events. But of course, those arguing that the imperial presidency must be curtailed tend to also follow up by saying we need a National Assembly-centered government, we need more power in the National Assembly, we need a parliamentary or semi-parliamentary system, which is a very compelling argument if you happen to be a member of the National Assembly. So I don't think that's going to happen, and I think history has also shown, if you go back to 1960, Korea's parliamentary experiment did not go well. And other countries that have a more parliamentary, assembly-centered government they're also having crises of authority in their governments. So I would say the problem lies elsewhere.
Meanwhile, Kelly, what has been the response from South Korea's allies to its latest political predicament?
Yeah, I think there's been some shock throughout the world when martial law was first imposed. I know for me, I was awake when this happened, and my first thought was, do the Americans know about this? That might just be my mindset as a foreign correspondent from the US, but I think it was pretty clear that the United States did not underwrite this idea from President Yoon in the beginning. They had expressed their shock and disappointment pretty early on. They were quick to say publicly that they didn't know that this was coming, which is a way of saying we don't necessarily endorse this. And since President Yoon has been detained and is facing charges of insurrection, I mean, the State Department has been pretty clear that they see the overturning of martial law and the prosecution going on right now as kind of a sign of South Koreans' resilience to democratic challenges. They said that this was a test to South Korean democracy. All of that indicates that the United States did not support this and wants to see a democratic process play out. In Japan, I mean, one of Yoon's hallmark things that he has done in office is kind of return Korea to this idea of engagement with Japan and trilateral talks. And now a lot of that is under question, although Japan's chief cabinet secretary has said that they continue to see South Korea as an important neighbor and that nothing has changed. And certainly as North Korea continues to turn away from engaging with the South and the West, the three need each other and they need cooperation there.
Right. Colin, quite a number of foreign media outlets have also touched upon the deep political divide among Korea's youth, given its political turmoil. What have been your own observations?
I've observed that some of these foreign media outlets have seen fit to call the situation a K-drama. I suppose that's irresistible. It is, I guess there is some dramatic element to the politics here. And yes, specifically in the case of Korean youth, you do see, what fascinates me the most is, well, of course, Western media tend to frame what's been going on around this whole fiasco in American terms specifically, sort of mapping elements of American politics, be they official governmental terms or sort of social terms, just controversies that are active in the US, they sort of get mapped onto the situation in Korea, and they don't always fit very well. But what's more fascinating about that than the fact that the media do that, which you'd expect, is that sometimes the young Koreans involved in these controversies themselves take those terms from the Western media and sort of apply them to themselves. There's this whole idea of the sort of incels versus the feminists, these terms are American in origin, not necessarily feminism per se, but the way it's used over there right now. I don't know that they transplant quite so cleanly as sort of a Western reader or viewer would imagine, but it's fascinating to see them be sort of used here by Koreans as well, maybe with the same meaning, maybe not, but I mean, a vivid example is the "Stop the Steal" signs that have been seen. And those much has been made of those in the Western media. These sort of signs saying "Stop the Steal," that's a slogan that supporters of, I guess, going to be president again, Trump in the US, were using after the 2020 election when he was taken out of power, or by which he was taken out of power, with the sense that that election had been stolen and that theft needed to be stopped. Now we have "Stop the Steal" brought to Korea with a sense of, I guess, that the presidency is being stolen from Yoon Suk Yeol. In any case, I never like to see a framework taken straight from another country and applied to Korea, but it happens all the time. And I think it's going to still happen to the point that it gets internalized in Korea.
Right. Kelly, foreign media coverage also laments the reality that Korea's political polarization may not end once this political saga, if you will, comes to an end. What have been some of the grim forecasts for the future?
Yeah, I think that analysis really comes from the fact that, President Yoon may be fueling polarization in Korea right now, but he's not the lone cause of it. I read some of these pieces that have been out recently, and I think it's important to note that, he justified his declaration of martial law by essentially saying that he couldn't get anything done, that the National Assembly is in gridlock. I'm not supporting the fact that he imposed martial law, but I do think that speaks to a level of polarization that has already been occurring. His election itself was polarizing. I mean, in South Korea, there's kind of a culture war that has been brewing between men and women, the left and the right, for quite some time now, and we really saw that in the demographics of this recent vote. President Yoon also has a very small fringe faction that is being fueled by conspiracy theories being put out on YouTube that basically suggest that the general elections in April of last year were not legitimate. I think this is another sign of the polarization going on. But we have to remember that, most South Koreans, when martial law was shot down, supported the fact that it was shot down, supported some kind of idea of prosecuting or seeing consequences for Yoon. And we're only talking about a few thousand out of about 50 million people who were there trying to block his arrest recently. So I don't want to overplay the level of polarization, but I think the point of those pieces in the Western media is to say, this isn't going to go away the second that he's arrested or he faces some kind of consequence, that this is an issue that existed before him and will probably exist after him, that there's, kind of a fractured unity in South Korean politics.
Right. Colin, some pundits here believe that if the president is reinstated and not removed from the top office, it will set a disturbing precedent for future leaders. Do you suppose this belief merits some concern?
Well, as I understand it, that argument holds that if he's reinstated, this legitimizes imposing martial law. Like it makes what he did make sense, or it will make sense to future presidents. If they get in a sticky situation, they can simply impose martial law and they will be reinstated later. I wonder about that. I suspect most of the pundits who are making this argument, they are on the opposite side of the political fence, and what they want not to happen is the reinstatement of Yoon Suk Yeol. They're not, I don't know how concerned they really are. I don't want to read minds, but I don't know how concerned they really are about setting a precedent. It's not wrong, though. I mean, we don't want presidents thinking that martial law is a recourse that should be so close at hand. It is a recourse that is available to them legally, as we've talked about. You know, you knew that, but it's not sort of a button we'd like to have available to push right there. But if we're talking about setting a bad precedent, I would say a worse precedent is throwing presidents in jail in Korea. Because if you do that, if the presidents get the idea, or if the political culture becomes such that, well, I could become president, I'm going to get locked up anyway, or they're going to try to, I might as well just do whatever I can. I might as well be brazen in office. I might as well push the limits in office, because they're going to get me for anything. I mean, there's that saying about you beat a rug hard enough, dust comes out. You know, if the other side is just going to get me for whatever they can, I might as well abuse my power in office. Of course, the actual president won't say it in those terms, but again, if we're talking about what precedent is going to be harmful in the future, I would say maybe the one Korea has already set of being sort of punitive in an excessive way toward presidents or former presidents.
Right. Kelly, we've seen protests taking place both in support of and in opposition of the president. Now, hardliners on both sides claim, or pledge that is, a civil war if the Constitutional Court does not rule in their favor. Based on your coverage of these public rallies currently taking place here in the country, do you believe that the prospects of such a reality are high?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think that rhetoric is a little bit overblown. I think on both sides, what people want is a clarity of the facts and accountability. Unfortunately, some of that is being skewed by an issue that's chronic in all democracies right now, which is fake news, disinformation, misinformation. So I don't know if we'll ever fully arrive at a consensus on what happened and who should be accountable and the legality of it all. But I mean, just to speak quite frankly here, we're talking about, again, a few thousand people that tried to block President Yoon's detainment the other day out of 50 million in a country where most of them, most people polled do support some kind of legal consequence for what happened. So we're far from saying that there is no consensus. There actually is a majority opinion going on here about the imposition of martial law. And then also, the way that this was handled in a very nonviolent manner, I think is a good indicator that we're probably not headed towards imminent civil war or bloodshed. Quite frankly, the availability of weapons to the general public is not what it is in other countries where we're worried about this, like the United States. So I do think it is shocking, it's surprising, and it's deeply concerning that that kind of rhetoric is being used at all, right? Just as the imposition of martial law was very shocking in a country that is this democratically sound and this developed. At the same time, I don't think we're going to see a situation where on a large scale the country breaks out into a civil war soon. I hope I don't eat my words saying that.
And I will end with those reassuring words from you, Kelly. Thank you so much for them, and thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you.
Colin, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this week's editions of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Do join us again same time next Monday for more panel discussions.